Imagine a land of breathtaking nature, mountains, wildlife preserves, lakes, views so insanely beautiful they'll blow your mind. No wonder Montana is called the Treasure State. But this treasure lives in solitude. You can drive for dozens, even hundreds of miles and not come across a single soul. Why? Let me tell you. The loneliest state. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. So, picture a huge stretch of land in the northwest of the U.S. This is Montana, a state bigger than Germany, 3 times the size of the UK and twice the size of Florida. Its area is almost 147,000 square miles, and among all the states, only Alaska, Texas, and California are larger. But at the same time, only about 1.13 million people live here, which is fewer than in Houston, Texas, and only a bit more than in Jacksonville, Florida. So here's the paradox. Land the size of a whole country with a population no bigger than a mid-sized American city. The population density here is just 3 people per 0.4 square miles. For comparison, Michigan has 69. The difference is staggering. Only 2 states, Alaska and Wyoming, can boast being even more deserted. Naturally, there's an explanation for all this. First of all, climate plays its part. Winter in Montana comes early and leaves late. By October, snowstorms and frosts are not uncommon here, and it stays that way until April. While in the mountains, snow can linger until May. More than 200 days a year bring freezing temperatures, and that makes life truly harsh. Roads ice over, power goes out, plans fall apart, the economy grinds to a halt. At the same time, Montana is known for its cold weather records. Near Helena, the temperature once dropped to minus 69 degrees Fahrenheit. On ordinary winter days from November through March, different towns see anything from minus 9 to minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit and even lower. But the winter of 1886 to 1887 is remembered as the worst of all. Back then, the January frost literally split trees apart. Storms hurled icy snow particles, and eyewitnesses compared them to mica flakes flying straight into people's faces. Snowdrifts turned into traps from which neither cows nor horses could escape. Again, according to eyewitnesses, the cold sheared flesh right down to the bone. In the end, the state lost 60% of all its cattle, about 362,000 head. This nightmare happened long ago, but it shows just how dangerous Montana's nature can be. Naturally, winters like these affect not only daily life and household, but also the wallet. In Montana, you end up paying more for heating in winter and for cooling in summer because the temperature swings are too sharp. On average, across the U.S., the monthly electricity bill is $118, but in Montana, it's $125. Altogether, utilities cost residents about $40 more than the national average. But that's just one of the reasons why living here isn't easy. The second reason is geographic isolation. Montana's not just about freezing winters, but also the feeling of being truly cut off from the rest of the world. Scientists from Oxford's Big Data Institute created a map that calculated travel times to every point on Earth. They factored in roads, transport, and terrain to see how easy it is for people to reach cities. This matters because access to civilization directly affects healthcare, the economy, and life as a whole. So in the continental U.S., almost everyone lives close to major cities. 98% of Americans are within an hour's drive of an urban zone. But there are exceptions. The Washington Post used an Oxford database and identified the most remote place in the country. It turned out to be the town of Glasgow in Montana, not far from the Canadian border. To reach the nearest city with more than 75,000 people, you need to drive at least 4.5 hours in any direction. Glasgow's often called the middle of nowhere. There used to be an Air Force base nearby, but it was shut down back in 1976. And since then, the town has slowly been fading. Today, about 3,200 people live here, and for them, extreme isolation defines literally everything, from access to medical and social services to how relationships develop inside a small community. And this isn't a one-off case. 4 out of the 10 most isolated towns in the U.S. are right here in Montana and neighboring Nevada, often on the land of or right next to Native American reservations. So the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the country isn't rare here. It's more like the rule. Montana has more than just one or two places like Glasgow. The whole state's dotted with dozens of small, isolated towns. You drive past the last gas station, the cell service disappears, the mountains start to loom up ahead, and that's when the state reveals its true face. Out here in the backcountry, you can come across towns where there are more moose in the neighborhoods than people. And on the shelf of the grocery store, there's always a can of bear spray. People live in small, tight-knit communities, 100 or 2 at most. And beyond that, for hundreds of miles, there are only forests and impenetrable wilderness. Some villages don't even have power lines or paved roads. For example, the residents of Polebridge in Flathead County rely on solar panels, generators, and wood stoves. It's not that it's bad, it's just nothing like what most people think of as convenient or normal life. There's another problem too, transportation. In Montana and neighboring North Dakota, there are more cars registered than people, including kids. And it's not surprising because without your own car, you're not going anywhere in these parts. Traditional bus systems only work in big cities, Billings, Missoula, and Great Falls. In the smaller towns, public transport just doesn't make sense. Too few people to keep buses or light rail running. Taxis aren't an option either. In the western part of the state, many towns can't even afford to run their own taxi companies, and hardly anyone is willing to pay full price for an occasional ride. In other words, no buses or taxis for you. Either get behind the wheel yourself or stay out of the world. And if the car breaks down, good luck surviving. Another problem in Montana is wildfires. They happen here all the time. And it's not just about droughts or lightning. The eastern part of the state sits on coal seams, geological formations that look like a layered cake. A layer of rock, a layer of coal, and then rock again. That dark color at the base of the slope points to a coal seam. And when coal catches on fire, it can smolder for years, invisible to the eye. It looks something like this, but under certain conditions, the hidden fire can turn into a full-blown disaster. In 2021, it was an underground coal seam that caused Montana's biggest fire, Richard Spring. The blaze burned nearly 173,000 acres in Rosebud County and on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Back then, pastures, fences, and buildings went up in flames. Local farmers had to spend tens of thousands of dollars on hay to feed their livestock, change grazing patterns, and rebuild their farms. The problem is, stories like this aren't out of the ordinary. They're pretty much everyday life for many people in eastern Montana. So back in 2012, after a series of wildfires, about 1,500 coal seams caught fire here. In the summer of 2021 alone, the state's Department of Natural Resources recorded 458 fires, a 10-year record. And by 2024, fires had once again destroyed land, homes, livestock. And besides the direct damage, coal fires are dangerous because they release toxins. When coal burns, up to 50 different chemical compounds are released into the air, which worsen lung and heart diseases, poison the air, and have toxic effects on the body as a whole. Basically, eastern Montana sits on land that could just ignite under your feet. Who'd want to live here? The economy of Montana is another reason why there aren't many people here. The state's median household income is about $70,000 a year, while across the country it's higher, almost $78,000. Per capita income is also noticeably below the national level, and poverty in some areas, especially on Native American reservations, remains a real issue. Historically, the state's economy relied on the primary sector, that is, agriculture, logging, mining, and energy. Today, these industries are still important, but together they provide less than 10% of jobs. Meanwhile, most people work in the service sector, a broad category full of low-paying positions. Basically, Montana workers have earned less than the U.S. average for decades. And although wages have gone up a bit in recent years and unemployment has dropped, the state's average is still only about 72% of the national level. And overall, no matter which numbers you look at, the situation isn't that bright. By GDP size, Montana ranks 46th out of 50 states. In terms of economic prospects, it's 35th. Not exactly rock bottom, but definitely not at the top. The lack of jobs in tech and high-paying fields forces many residents to look for other ways, so it's not uncommon for people to hold down 2 jobs at once. At least by this measure, Montana consistently makes the top 10 leaders. And, of course, the state has a peculiar feature: there are still more cows than people here. In 2024, they counted over 2 million head of cattle, while the population was only about 1.14 million. That's almost 2 cows per person. But livestock isn't IT, and young people are increasingly leaving for other states in search of a different life. As a result, Montana ends up in a vicious cycle. Jobs exist, but they're mostly low-paying, so people leave, and gradually there are fewer workers. Opportunities are scarce, prospects slim. Even those born here often leave the state for good. Altogether, this creates a combination of reasons we've already mentioned, and we'll return to. Healthcare also plays a very serious role. In a state like Montana, where people live miles apart, medicine becomes a true challenge. Large hospitals exist only in more populated areas, leaving rural folks mostly with small clinics that offer a limited range of services. Sometimes, to get through what seems like a simple, even standard checkup like a mammogram or MRI, people have to travel more than 100 miles. The trip one way takes several hours, and sometimes a whole day, especially if the weather turns bad or the mountains cause unexpected problems. Some don't have reliable transport. Others just can't bring themselves to go unless absolutely necessary. Imagine needing medical care but being physically unable to get there. In the end, people put off doctor visits until the situation becomes critical. And these aren't isolated cases or problems of just a few people. It's an issue across the whole state. A third of Montana's population lives in rural or border areas where access to healthcare is, well, not great. On top of that, almost half of the emergency departments operate without doctors on round-the-clock duty, so in a real emergency, help might arrive too late. The situation is made worse by a wave of rural hospital closures across the country. Since 2005, more than 100 have shut down, and dozens more have been turned into emergency-only facilities. In Montana itself, the picture looks downright alarming. Almost 2/3 of hospitals have already cut back their services, and a quarter are at risk of full closure or conversion in the next couple of years. The main reason's always the same: financial instability. Few patients, huge costs, and the system just can't handle it. On the map of rural healthcare facilities in Montana, you can see that each county only has a few, sometimes just 2 or 3. For a state this size, that's barely anything. And for many residents, getting medical care is hundreds of miles away. And that's yet another reason why living here isn't easy. But you know what's interesting? Living in Montana, despite all the state's problems, actually turns out to be expensive too. In 2005, the cost of living for a single person here is around $2,600 a month on average, and a family of 4 needs over $5,700. Compared to the national average, that's about 5% higher. You'd think that in a rural state with low population density and a bunch of problems, everything would be cheaper. But it's actually the opposite. And it's not just about the overall stats, because the cost of living really depends on the place. Want to live near a national park? Be ready to pay more. Dreaming of a house with a view of the mountains or a lake? That's extra too. Even college towns cost more than you might expect. In real life, you notice it in the simplest things. Food is typically 2 to 5% pricier than the country's average. Gas is slightly higher, around $3.14 per gallon versus $3.03 nationally. Internet costs $123 a month compared to $80 on average in the U.S. And out in the countryside, it gets worse. There's almost no competition. The selection is limited, and getting connected to high-speed lines can run hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single home. Don't forget the huge distances. On top of that, there are record-high property taxes and expensive utilities, which I've already mentioned. As a result, even everyday expenses are a struggle for many, and even schools are cutting costs. Some operate less than 5 days a week. And in Bozeman, they're trying to hire teachers who still live with their parents because a teacher's salary isn't enough to afford housing. In other towns, businesses are shutting down entirely. For example, last year the local sawmill, Pyramid Lumber, went bankrupt in Sealy Lake. And here's the paradox. Salaries here are below the U.S. average, but you have to pay more. So you end up in a situation where the state's economy is already weak and the cost of living keeps rising. And there's no sign that this increase will slow down anytime soon. Now let's talk about what often ends up being the deal breaker for anyone: housing. And here things are not so simple for Montana. In 2025, the state topped Realtor.com's list as the least affordable place to buy a home in the whole country. The average home price is almost $650,000, while the median family income is only $72,000. To buy a house like that, you'd need to earn $100,000 more. It turns out Montana's now on the same level as New York, California, or Hawaii, even though it should probably be one of the most affordable states. How did that happen? Simple. During the pandemic, remote workers from expensive regions, mostly from the West Coast, poured in. These are people who could afford to sell their house in California or Seattle and then easily offer more than the local price for a place in Montana. They were drawn by the nature, the mountains, skiing in winter, fishing in summer, and all kinds of outdoor activities. And also the chance to work from home while living in peace and quiet. But for the locals, it turned into a disaster. From 2010 to 2020, Montana's population grew by almost 10%, but new housing only increased by 7%. From 2020 to 2023, growth picked up another 5% and the market completely overheated. In the end, young people buying their first home just couldn't find a place in the state. For them, a home in Montana became nearly out of reach, and many were forced to leave. This isn't just a local story, it's part of a bigger trend. Young Americans are increasingly leaving big cities for quieter, less populated areas. But on the migration map of Gen Z and millennials, Western Montana really stands out. It literally glows blue, showing that new people are moving in. Only for those born here, the influx brings rising prices, taxes, and makes owning a home nearly impossible. Living among beautiful mountains and rivers is a dream for many. I wouldn't say no to it myself. But being able to do that in Montana is far from easy. Life in Montana works in a unique way since the small population is spread out very unevenly. A little more than half of the residents live in cities, and all the rest are in tiny towns, with neighbors sometimes separated by miles. The western part of the state is dominated by the Rocky Mountains. They stretch here from Canada, from the northwest to the southeast, and it's in their narrow valleys that small towns hide. People live there in thin strips along the rivers, like beads on a long string. The eastern part of Montana is completely different. Gentle hills, millions of cows and sheep grazing, and only occasional signs of human presence. On the Great Plains, it's the same story. A bit more life shows up only in valleys that can be irrigated. People settle there, farms and small towns pop up, but step aside for a bit, and once again, there's endless emptiness before your eyes. In general, Montana is just a series of mountain valleys and plains, where people are clustered in little islands of civilization. Hundreds of miles of roads run between these islands, and sometimes there's nothing in between. And that shapes everything, from infrastructure to the overall way it feels. But let's get a bit more specific. In December 2024, Montana got mediocre and even downright bad marks on almost every part of its infrastructure, from roads and bridges to schools, airports, and sewage treatment systems. The situation seems alarming. In 2023, a third of urban roads and a fifth of rural roads were in bad shape. Severe winters just make things worse. Snow, ice, and repeated freezing and thawing literally rip the asphalt to pieces. More and more bridges are being closed, which hurts the region's economy, because without bridges, there's no real connection between cities. Trucks have to go around and deliver goods, so prices eventually rise for everyone. The power grids can't keep up either. The gear is old and not ready for the state's weather, and in dozens of rural communities, the infrastructure is literally on the brink of falling apart. Lots of small towns rely on water systems that haven't changed since the late 1960s. In summer, when the population of these towns temporarily triples, water shuts off. And if a fire happens while a well is out, the fire department just won't get the pressure, meaning they can't handle the fire. In this context, complaints about the internet don't seem all that serious. But even here, Montana holds anti-records. On average, nationwide, internet speed is twice as fast as it is here. As a result, residents of the state have to deal not only with bad roads and a fragile water system, but also with the slowest internet in America. But wait, I haven't told you everything about the roads yet. The roads of Montana are something else. For some, a drive on a dirt road feels like an adventure. Getting to the start of a bike trail, finding a secluded fishing spot, or heading out on vacation. But here in Montana, dirt roads aren't exotic or fun. They're just part of everyday life. The U.S. actually has plenty of these roads. Out of 4,039,000 miles, roughly a third are still gravel and dirt. But in Montana, the dirt road network is still especially widespread, which isn't surprising, considering 96% of the state's roads run through rural areas. The thing is, the consequences are pretty serious. Dirt roads don't hold up well against harsh winters and spring thaws, get washed out by rain, and turn dangerous fast. As a result, the state tops the SAD charts, 22.6 road deaths per year for every 100,000 people. In short, for a lot of people in Montana, the road to work or the store isn't asphalt, it's a gravel strip, where every trip is risky. Actually, Montana's never been an easy place to live, and you can see that even from its history. In 1862, the U.S. passed the Homestead Act, which allowed any settler to get a plot of land of nearly 160 acres for free. You just had to prove ownership and start working the land. And the lands were offered out west and in the Midwest. In other parts of the country, this law sparked a huge rush of people. But settlers weren't exactly flocking to Montana. The reason's simple. 160 acres in a dry region was too little to feed a family. There wasn't enough water, the soil was poor, and farming turned into a fight against nature. In the end, northern Montana was settled later than other regions. By the time settlers finally got here, the best land was already taken. People tried to make a life in harsh conditions, but it wasn't farming so much as a constant fight to survive. Overall, it's kind of a tradition. The feeling that Montana isn't exactly a place you come to for an easy life. Even the capital of Montana doesn't feel like a big city. Helena has only about 32,000 people, fifth from last among all U.S. state capitals. And as for the small rural towns, many of them are literally fighting to survive today. They once thrived thanks to the railroad, but those days are long gone. Now these places are slowly emptying out. Take Sidney, for example, a small town in the eastern part of the state, almost right on the border with North Dakota. It's sometimes called the last stop before the next state. Back in 2020, just over 6,300 people lived there. And by 2023, the population had dropped to 6,112. Sidney's been named the fastest shrinking town in Montana, and it's far from the only one following this pattern. All of this is part of the bigger picture. While other regions were growing and developing, Montana more often lost than gained. In the 20th century, a phenomenon historians call the depopulation of the Great Plains emerged here. People were leaving rural areas for cities or moving to the coasts, places with more jobs and opportunities. Some Montana counties lost as much as 65 to 75% of their population back then, and that sense of people moving away still lingers in Montana. But Montana has another sad feature. It's an aging state. Today, it's considered the oldest state west of the Mississippi because half of its population is already over 40. And by average age, Montana ranks 9th in the country. It's just behind Florida, Maine, and several other eastern states where retirees traditionally go to live out their days. The reasons are clear. Young people leave looking for career opportunities because the state can't offer enough options for professional growth. In their place, a lot of older folks stay behind, for whom Montana is a place for a peaceful life after retirement. Sure, a calm retirement doesn't really go well with the local health care, but if you've spent your whole life in one state, where else would you go? In the end, it paints a contradictory situation. On the one hand, the population is aging and local young people are increasingly leaving. On the other, well-off young people from other states are moving in for the nature and beautiful life. How this balance will turn out, only time will tell. Make sure to hit that like button. See you later.